a veteran Navy SEAL, inherited a remote forest property from his late uncle. But his German shepherd kept leading him toward a rusted military ship hidden among the pines. What they discovered there was a secret buried for more than 50 years. A secret tied to forgotten rescue dogs, missing records, and a truth nobody wanted uncovered. The deeper they searched, the darker the story became, and what waited beneath that ship would change their lives forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like, subscribe, and join us for today's story. The letter came on a Wednesday morning, folded twice, sealed in a yellowed envelope that smelled faintly of old paper and cedar smoke. Caleb Rourke stood in the doorway of his rented room above a hardware store in Duluth, Minnesota, holding it between two fingers as if it might burn him. He was 43 years old, a former Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, a hard-trained body that still carried the discipline of war, and a face carved by weather, silence, and things he had learned not to say out loud. His jaw was sharp, his cheekbones defined, his light scruffy beard trimmed close against tanned skin. His deep blue-gray eyes rarely gave away much, except on mornings like this, when the past slipped a knife under the ribs. His hair was short, dark brown, cut in a military style with early silver at the temples, practical, neat, like a man who had learned that order outside the body sometimes helped contain disorder inside it. He wore his usual clothes, an olive green field jacket worn soft at the elbows, a red and dark blue plaid shirt underneath, dark blue cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and an old military watch on his left wrist. The watch had survived sand, saltwater, gunfire, and one helicopter landing that should have ended worse than it did. At his feet sat Ranger. The German shepherd was 7 years old, male, and built like a working K9 should be. Balanced, muscular, agile, without wasted weight. His short, dense black and tan coat carried a dark saddle across his back, and his intelligent dark eyes watched Caleb with the patience of a creature who understood more than language. A black leather collar circled his neck. Ranger did not bark at the letter. He simply lifted his nose, sniffed once, and pressed it gently against Caleb's left hand. Caleb looked down. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." The letter was from a lawyer in a northern town Caleb had only heard mentioned by his late uncle once or twice. His uncle, Elias Rourke, had died 3 weeks earlier, leaving Caleb a piece of forest land near Lake Superior, 27 acres of pine, birch, Cold Creek water, and an old cabin that had not been lived in for years. There was one line in the lawyer's note that Caleb read 3 times. "Your uncle requested that you visit the property in person before making any decision." That was all. No explanation, no sentimental message. Elias had never been sentimental. He had been the kind of man who fixed a roof during a thunderstorm, because waiting for sunshine felt lazy. By noon, Caleb had packed everything he owned into the back of his old truck. It was not much. A duffel bag, a tool roll, 2 wool blankets, a small box of military papers he never opened, Ranger's gear, and a coffee thermos with a dent shaped like bad luck. The road north was bright and cold. Pine forests rose on both sides like green cathedral walls, their branches holding late autumn light. The sky was pale blue, washed clean by wind from the lake. Every mile pulled Caleb farther from noise, bills, crowded streets, and the polite pity of people who knew he had served but did not know what service had taken. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, watching the road as if he were reading invisible signs. Caleb glanced at him. "You see something I don't?" Ranger blinked once. "That's your answer for everything." The dog gave a soft huff, almost offended. Caleb's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but close enough to count. By late afternoon, he reached the town of Briar Glen, a place tucked between timberland and water, where the streets were clean, the church bell tower was white, and every storefront looked as though it had survived at least 3 harsh winters and one scandal nobody discussed anymore. He stopped at the ranger station first, a low wooden building with a green metal roof and stacked firewood beside the steps. A woman stepped out before he reached the door. She was in her early 50s, tall enough to meet a man's eyes without lifting her chin, with the strong, weathered build of someone who had spent her life walking trails instead of talking about them. Her fair skin carried light freckles across the nose and cheeks. Her green-gray eyes were sharp, not unkind, but cautious. Chestnut-brown hair, streaked slightly by time, was tied low behind her neck. She wore a forest green ranger jacket over a cream sweater, dark brown hiking pants, brown hiking boots, and a ranger badge clipped neatly at her chest. "You're Caleb Rourke," she said. He stopped. "That obvious? Old truck, military posture, German shepherd who looks like he could judge a man's soul before breakfast." Her gaze moved to Ranger. "And Elias said you might come." Caleb felt something shift inside him. "You knew my uncle." Most people knew Elias. She held out a hand. "Myra Ellison, forest ranger." Her handshake was firm. Ranger sniffed the air near her sleeve, then sat calmly. Mara noticed. Good dog, he knows, most good dogs do. For a moment, the wind moved through the pines behind the station, carrying the clean scent of resin and cold earth. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Caleb noticed how Mara's eyes flicked toward the northern ridge. "You're going to the property today?" she asked. "That was the plan. Then I should tell you something before the town does." Caleb waited. Mara's expression tightened, not with fear exactly, but with the old fatigue of a person tired of warning people who never listened. "There's a structure on that land. Something left from a Cold War military project. A patrol vessel hull. Not a full ship anymore, though people call it one. It was dragged inland decades ago for testing. Most records are gone. Most locals stay away." Caleb looked past her toward the forest. "Why?" Mara did not answer immediately. Then she said, "Because at night when the wind runs through the steel, it sounds like crying." Caleb had heard many things cry in the dark. Men, radios, metal under pressure. A dog once, far away, behind smoke. He pushed the memory down before it grew teeth. "What do they call it?" he asked. Mara's eyes held his. The weeping ship, a quieter man might have turned back. A more wounded one might have laughed. Caleb did neither. He only nodded. "I'll be careful." Mara looked at Ranger. "Make sure he is." Ranger's ears twitched as if he accepted the assignment. Before Caleb left town, he stopped by the sheriff's office to sign an access notice for the private road. The man behind the counter was not the current sheriff, though he moved like someone the building still remembered. Owen Briggs was 65, large through the shoulders despite his age, with silver hair, a thick silver mustache, and a weathered face that looked carved from winter bark. He wore a brown leather jacket, a gray-red flannel shirt, dark blue jeans, brown work shoes, and an old cap pulled low. He studied Caleb for a long moment. "Elias's nephew," Owen said. "Former Navy." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Former enough," Owen grunted. "That land doesn't like strangers. Land doesn't usually get a vote." "No," Owen said. "But what men leave on it sometimes does." Ranger stood beside Caleb, silent and still. Owen looked at the dog, and something passed over his face. Recognition, regret, or maybe both. "You keep him close," Owen said. "I always do." Owen slid the signed paper across the desk. "Road gets rough after the 3rd mile. Cabin roof may leak. Don't go near the vessel after dark." Caleb took the paper. Everyone keeps saying that. Then maybe everyone got one thing right. Outside, the sun had begun to lower behind the tree line. Caleb drove north out of Briar Glen, past the last mailbox, past the last porch light, into a corridor of pine and birch where the road narrowed until branches brushed the truck like hands. The forest was bright but not cheerful. It had the stillness of a church after a funeral, full of light and memory. The cabin appeared just before dusk. It sat in a small clearing, weathered but standing, with a slanted porch, a stone chimney, and windows filmed with dust. Behind it, the land climbed toward a ridge thick with black spruce. Caleb stepped out, and cold air settled into his lungs. For the first time in months, maybe years, no one expected anything from him. No landlord, no commanding officer, no polite neighbor asking if he was adjusting okay. Just trees, wind, a cabin, a dog. Ranger jumped down from the truck and began sniffing the ground. At first, his movements were ordinary, checking the porch, the woodpile, the base of the steps. Then he stopped. His body went still, not alert in the usual way, not aggressive, not afraid, listening. Caleb knew that posture. He had seen it before in places where silence hid something alive, or something dead, or something waiting between the two. "What is it?" he asked. Ranger did not look at him. He stared toward the ridge. Then, from deep in the forest, Caleb heard it. A low metallic moan, long, hollow, almost human. The sound moved through the trees and faded into the cooling air. Caleb's hand drifted unconsciously toward the empty place where a rifle would once have been. Ranger rose slowly and took one step forward. Then another. "Ranger," Caleb said. The dog stopped but did not turn. The forest darkened by a shade. The pines seemed to lean closer, ancient witnesses in green robes. Somewhere on that ridge, unseen water ran over unseen steel, and the sound came again, softer this time, like a wounded thing trying not to be found. Caleb felt the old scar inside him stir, not on his skin, deeper, the place where memory kept its dead. For a moment he was not in Northwoods. He was in smoke and dust, hearing a radio crackle, hearing a handler shout a dog's name, hearing himself give the order to move because staying would have killed everyone still alive. Ranger turned then. The German shepherd crossed back to Caleb and pressed his nose against Caleb's knee. Firm, grounding, present. Caleb exhaled. "All right," he whispered. "Not tonight." They carried supplies into the cabin by lantern light. The place smelled of dust, old pine boards, cold ashes, and a faint trace of his uncle's pipe tobacco. There was a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a rusted stove, and shelves lined with jars long emptied by time. On the wall hung a faded map of the property, its corners curled. Caleb found a penciled mark near the northern ridge. No label, just a small circle. He stood staring at it for longer than he meant to. Ranger sat beside him, eyes lifted to the same mark. "You know something about this place?" Caleb asked. The dog's tail did not move. Night settled hard. Caleb made coffee on the old stove, ate beans from a can, and checked the windows twice without meaning to. The cabin groaned as temperatures dropped. Wind slipped through cracks in the boards with thin, ghostly fingers. He spread a blanket on the floor near the stove for Ranger, but the dog did not lie down. Instead, Ranger walked to the front door and stood there, waiting. Caleb watched him from the table. Outside, moonlight silvered the clearing. The forest beyond the porch looked less like trees now, and more like a congregation gathered around a secret. "You're making this dramatic," Caleb muttered. Ranger ignored him. "That's my job, by the way." Brooding veteran, limited emotional range, terrible coffee, still nothing. Caleb sighed, rose, and opened the door. Cold air entered at once. Ranger stepped onto the porch and stood at the top of the stairs. His ears were high, his body was steady. He did not growl, he did not bark, he simply stared toward the ridge. Caleb stepped out beside him, and there, through a break in the trees far above the cabin, he saw it for the first time. Not clearly, only pieces. A dark, impossible shape resting against the slope. Curved steel, rusted edges, a broken rail catching moonlight. Water glinting as it spilled from somewhere within the hull and fell down the rocks in silver threads. The weeping ship. It did not belong in the forest. And yet the forest had grown around it, over it, through it, as if trying to claim the old wound and turn it into something holy. Ranger remained motionless. Caleb felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. The metallic moan came again, deeper than before, rolling down from the ridge and through the pines. This time, beneath it, Caleb thought he heard something else. Not a voice, not exactly. A rhythm, tap, pause, tap, like something inside the old hull answering the wind. Caleb looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes reflected the moonlight, dark and knowing. "You hear it too," Caleb said. Ranger did not move. For hours, the German shepherd stood guard on that porch, watching the forest as if an invisible command had been given. And Caleb, who had spent years believing the dead only followed men from behind, began to wonder whether some of them waited ahead, patient as winter, faithful as dogs, calling from places no one had dared to enter. The next morning arrived clear and cold. Sunlight spilled through the tall pines surrounding the cabin, painting long golden stripes across the frost-covered ground. For a few moments, standing on the porch with a tin mug of coffee warming his hands, Caleb Rourke could almost pretend he had come here for peace. The illusion lasted less than a minute. Ranger was already staring toward the ridge. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the clearing, black and tan coat glowing under the morning sun. His ears were forward, his posture steady. He wasn't excited, he wasn't anxious, he was waiting. Caleb recognized that look. During deployments, Ranger's predecessor dogs had worn the same expression whenever they detected something important but couldn't explain it to the humans around them. Caleb took a sip of coffee. "You've got a one-track mind, don't you?" Ranger glanced back once, then returned his attention toward the ridge. Caleb sighed. Fine. An hour later, they were climbing. The slope behind the cabin was steeper than it had looked from below. Pine needles covered the ground in thick layers, making every step uncertain. The air smelled of sap, wet earth, and cold stone. As they climbed higher, the forest slowly changed. The trees grew farther apart. The wind became stronger. Then Caleb saw it. For the first time in daylight, the weeping ship. Even prepared, he stopped walking. The thing was enormous. Not a complete vessel, as Mara had explained, but the central hull section of an old naval patrol craft. Nearly half the structure had been removed decades ago. What remained was a massive skeleton of rusted steel resting against the rocky hillside. Nature had spent 50 years trying to reclaim it. Pines grew beside it, moss-covered sections of metal. Small birch trees emerged through openings in the deck. Water trickled continuously through fractured seams in the hull, creating dozens of tiny silver streams that flowed down the rocks below. From a distance, it looked less like a machine and more like a wounded animal slowly being absorbed by the forest. Caleb approached carefully. Years of military training never completely disappeared. His eyes automatically searched for hazards, weak structures, unstable footing, potential entrances, potential exits. Ranger moved ahead, paws silent against the steel and stone. Unlike Caleb, the dog showed no hesitation, almost as if he had already accepted that this place belonged to his world now. Caleb reached the hull and placed a hand against the cold metal. The steel was rough with rust. Beneath the corrosion, he found faded military markings. Most had become unreadable. One line remained partially visible. Property of United States Naval Research Command. Caleb frowned. Research Command. Not active military, not combat operations, something else. He moved slowly along the outer hull. Several sections appeared intentionally modified. Large mounting brackets, welded reinforcements, instrumentation ports long stripped of equipment. This had never been a normal vessel. Someone had used it for experiments. The question was why. Ranger suddenly stopped. The dog stood motionless near the center section of the hull. Caleb immediately noticed the change. "What is it?" Ranger lowered his head, sniffed, moved 2 steps, stopped again, then sat. That was unusual, very unusual. Ranger normally alerted by standing rigid. Sitting meant certainty. The dog believed something important was directly beneath him. Caleb examined the area. At first glance, nothing looked remarkable. Only rusted steel, decades of weather damage, corrosion. Then he noticed something. The rust pattern wasn't consistent. One rectangular section appeared newer, not new exactly, but newer than everything surrounding it. Someone had welded it shut years after the vessel was abandoned. Caleb knelt, ran his fingers across the edges. The seams were obvious now, a concealed hatch. His pulse quickened, not from fear, from curiosity, that old familiar feeling from military operations. The moment before discovering something hidden, something important. He spent the next 3 hours working. Back at the cabin, he retrieved tools left by his uncle. Pry bars, a hammer, a portable cutting saw. The steel fought him every inch of the way. Twice he nearly gave up. 3 times he questioned his sanity. But Ranger never moved. The German Shepherd remained beside the hatch the entire time, watching, waiting, as if he already knew what lay beneath. Finally, with a groan of twisting metal, the welded panel shifted. Dust exploded upward. Cold air rushed from the darkness below. Caleb stepped back. His heart hammered. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness. Someone had hidden this place deliberately, and someone had wanted it forgotten. He switched on a flashlight. The beam pierced the shadows. Ranger moved beside him. Together they descended. The hidden compartment was larger than expected, much larger, nearly 30 feet long. Dry, protected, preserved. The air smelled of dust, metal, and old wood. For several moments Caleb simply stared. This wasn't storage. This wasn't maintenance space. Someone had lived here. A narrow bunk stood against one wall. Shelves lined another. There was an old wood stove, cooking equipment, books, battery-powered lanterns, blankets, even a crude workbench. The newest items appeared at least 10 years old. Some were older. This place had clearly been occupied for a very long time. Caleb slowly walked through the room. Questions multiplied with every step. Who had lived here? Why hide? Why inside an abandoned naval structure? Then Ranger moved again. The dog approached a shelf near the far wall. He lowered his nose, sniffed carefully, then gently nudged a small object onto the floor. Caleb picked it up. His expression changed immediately. A collar, leather, weathered nearly beyond recognition, cracked by time. The metal tag attached to it was heavily corroded. Most of the letters had vanished. Only one word remained readable. Caleb stared at the tag, a dog's name, not a person's. A dog's. Something tightened inside his chest because suddenly the hidden room felt different. Not like a bunker, not like a shelter. Like a place someone had stayed for a reason. Someone who hadn't wanted to leave. Someone who had been searching, or mourning, or waiting. For what? Caleb couldn't yet tell. As Caleb turned the collar over in his hands, Ranger did something he had never seen before. The German Shepherd lowered himself beside the shelf, not sitting, not lying down, almost bowing. His ears flattened. His gaze remained fixed on the collar. For several long seconds, the powerful working dog didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. It looked less like detection and more like recognition, as if some instinct buried deep inside generations of service dogs understood that the object in Caleb's hands belonged to one of their own. The moment passed. Ranger stood again. But a chill lingered in the room because Caleb suddenly realized something. This hidden place wasn't just connected to military history. It was connected to a dog, and somehow that felt far more personal. The sun was already descending when Caleb finally returned to the cabin. He placed the collar on the kitchen table. The name Mercy remained visible under the lantern light. Mercy. The word stayed in his mind all afternoon. By evening, he had gathered notes, measurements, photographs, questions. Too many questions. Darkness settled over the forest. The wind picked up. Branches scraped softly against the cabin walls. Then headlights appeared outside. Caleb looked through the window. A black SUV rolled slowly into the clearing. Not local government, not law enforcement. Too expensive, too polished. The driver stepped out, a tall man in his late 50s. Around 6 feet tall, still physically fit despite his age. Dark hair streaked heavily with silver. Sharp features, cold blue eyes. The kind of face that smiled easily without revealing much. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a light blue shirt, dark trousers, expensive black boots, and a silver steel watch that caught the porch light. The man carried himself with confidence, not arrogance, ownership, as though he was accustomed to entering places that belonged to other people. Ranger immediately positioned himself beside Caleb, silent, alert. The visitor noticed. Beautiful dog, depends who you ask. The man smiled. Fair answer. He extended a hand. Victor Hale. Caleb recognized the name instantly. Owner of Hale Timber, the largest logging operation in the region. Victor's handshake was firm but controlled. Not a man who enjoyed showing weakness. Not a man who enjoyed surprises. I heard Elias left you the property, Victor said. News travels fast. Small town. The two men stood quietly for a moment. Wind moved through the trees. Victor looked toward the ridge, toward the hidden ship. Then back at Caleb. I'd like to make you an offer. Caleb already knew where this was going. Victor named a number. A very large number, far more than the land should have been worth. Enough money to solve nearly every financial problem Caleb had. Enough money to start over anywhere. Enough money to tempt almost anyone. Almost. Caleb studied him. Why? Victor's smile remained, but it became slightly thinner. I'd like to preserve the property. You own half the county already. Not this part. Caleb waited. Victor waited. Neither man blinked. Finally, Caleb shook his head. No. For the first time, a flicker of disappointment crossed Victor's face. Not anger. Something closer to concern. As though he had hoped this would be easy. I think you're making a mistake. Maybe. Victor glanced once more toward the ridge. Toward the hidden ship. Toward secrets Caleb had only begun to uncover. Then he looked at Ranger. The dog met his gaze without moving. For reasons Victor couldn't explain, that seemed to make him uncomfortable. The businessman nodded politely. Good night, Mr. Rourke. Then he left. The SUV disappeared into the darkness. Silence returned. Caleb remained on the porch long after the taillights vanished. Inside the cabin, the old collar rested on the table beneath the lantern glow. Outside, somewhere high above the trees, water continued running through rusted steel. The weeping ship was still keeping its secrets. But now Caleb knew one thing for certain. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide what was inside that vessel, and someone else was willing to pay a fortune to make sure those secrets stayed buried. The rain began before sunset. Not a violent storm at first. Just a steady gray curtain drifting across the northwoods, turning the distant pines into shadows and filling the air with the smell of wet earth and cedar. Caleb Rourke sat at the old cabin table with a lantern burning beside him. In front of him lay the collar, Mercy. The leather was cracked and brittle with age. Every time he looked at it, more questions appeared. Who had owned the dog? Who had lived inside the hidden compartment? And why had someone gone through so much effort to conceal that room? Across the cabin, Ranger rested near the stove. The 7-year-old German shepherd appeared calm, but Caleb knew better. The dog's ears kept shifting, listening, monitoring, waiting. Ranger had spent years as a working canine. Even at rest, part of him never truly stopped scanning the world. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. The hidden compartment in the ship had changed everything. The place was no longer just a forgotten military relic. Now it felt connected to real people, real lives, real losses. And somewhere in the middle of it all was the name Mercy. The next morning, Caleb drove back into Briar Glen. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads dark and shining. His first stop was the ranger station. Mara Ellison was already there. The 51-year-old ranger stood near a large wall map covered in trail markers and wildlife reports. Her forest green jacket hung neatly over the back of a chair. When Caleb entered carrying photographs from the hidden compartment, her expression changed immediately. What happened? Caleb spread the pictures across the desk. Mara studied them one by one. The bunk, the stove, the shelves, the collar, the hidden hatch. The color slowly drained from her face. I knew there were rumors, she said quietly. But not this. You've never been inside? She shook her head. No. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Mara walked toward a filing cabinet positioned against the far wall. The cabinet looked old enough to belong in a museum. Its metal surface carried scratches from decades of use. She unlocked the lowest drawer. Inside sat several thick folders, yellowed, worn, forgotten. Mara carried them to the table. My father spent years collecting information about the ship. Caleb looked up. Mara rarely spoke about him, not because she didn't care, because caring still hurt. Her father, Thomas Ellison, had disappeared 12 years earlier. Officially, authorities concluded he had gotten lost while investigating remote sections of forest. Nobody ever found a body. Nobody ever found answers. But Mara had never accepted that explanation. Thomas Ellison had been too experienced, too careful, too familiar with these woods. He believed something was hidden there, Mara said. Inside the ship? Maybe somewhere nearby. She opened the first folder. Inside were dozens of photocopied documents. Old military references, construction permits, research notes, budget requests. Most appeared harmless. Then Caleb noticed something strange. Several pages had entire sections removed. Not blacked out, removed completely. Pages missing, references missing, names missing. Someone had cleaned the records. Deliberately. Mara pointed toward a faded document. "Look here." Caleb leaned closer. The heading read, Northwoods Canine Response Initiative, date, 1974. His eyes narrowed. Canine, dogs. A second document mentioned emergency response training. A third referenced military rescue operations. A fourth contained almost no information at all because half the pages had vanished. Caleb slowly sat back. This wasn't a ship project. No. Mara nodded. It was something bigger. Throughout the morning, they continued searching. The deeper they looked, the stranger the records became. Equipment inventories disappeared after certain dates. Personnel names vanished from reports. Entire months were missing. It looked less like poor record-keeping and more like a systematic effort to erase history. By noon, Caleb's instincts were screaming. Someone had buried the truth. The question was why. Late that afternoon, they visited Sheriff Owen Briggs. The retired sheriff lived alone in a modest house overlooking the lake. At 65, Owen still carried the broad shoulders of his younger years. Though age had added stiffness to his movements, his silver mustache framed a face weathered by winters and hard decisions. When Caleb and Mara explained what they had discovered, Owen became unusually quiet. Too quiet. He stared out the window for several seconds before speaking. "I wondered how long it'd take." Mara frowned. "You knew. I knew pieces. You never told me." Pain flashed across Mara's face. Not anger, disappointment, the deeper kind. Owen sighed. 12 years ago, your father started asking questions nobody wanted asked. About the ship? About the project. Caleb leaned forward. "What project?" Owen shook his head. "I don't know the whole story." The answer sounded honest. Frustratingly honest. "But I know people got nervous whenever Thomas got close." "Who people?" Owen's eyes moved toward the window again, toward the distant forests. Powerful people. That was all he would say. The conversation ended with more questions than answers. By the time Caleb returned to the cabin, darkness had already fallen. The rain returned shortly after. Harder now. Colder. Wind pushed against the walls. Tree branches scraped across the roof. The entire forest seemed restless. Caleb built a fire. Ranger lay near the doorway. The collar remained on the table. The files remained spread across the room. For hours, Caleb reviewed photographs and reports. Names, dates, missing pages, missing years, missing truths. The more he learned, the less sense the official story made. Around midnight, he finally stood. His back ached, his eyes burned. The fire had burned low. The cabin had become quiet. Too quiet. Then Ranger stood, instantly, without warning. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body tightened. Caleb froze. Years of training took over. Something had changed. Ranger moved toward the door. Not cautiously, not curiously, urgently. The dog's gaze locked onto something outside. His ears flattened. His breathing quickened. For the first time since arriving in Northwoods, Caleb saw genuine unease in him. Ranger. The dog ignored the command. Then something happened that Caleb had never seen before. Ranger let out a short, sharp whine. Not fear, not aggression, grief. The sound was brief, barely audible, yet it carried an emotion so raw that Caleb felt it immediately. For one impossible moment, it sounded as though the dog had recognized something. Not smelled, not detected, recognized. The feeling vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ranger spun toward the door, then lunged outside into the storm. "Ranger!" Caleb grabbed his jacket and followed. Rain hammered the clearing. Wind bent the pine trees. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The German shepherd was already 50 yards ahead, moving fast, moving with purpose. Caleb ran. Branches slapped against his shoulders. Mud pulled at his boots. The beam from his flashlight bounced wildly through sheets of rain. "Ranger!" No response. The dog never looked back. The chase led beyond the ship, past the ridge, past the rusted hull, into a section of forest Caleb had never explored. The terrain grew rougher, steeper, rockier. Roots twisted across the ground like exposed veins. Lightning flashed. For a split second, the forest turned white. Then darkness returned. Ranger finally slowed. The dog stood at the base of a massive limestone wall rising from the forest floor. Water poured down the rock face. Vines and moss covered much of the surface. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Just stone, rain, trees. Then Ranger began digging. Caleb approached carefully. "What is it?" The dog clawed at tangled roots. Mud sprayed everywhere. More roots emerged. More vines, more debris. Then something appeared beneath them. Metal, rust-covered metal, straight edges, artificial, human-made. Caleb's pulse accelerated. He dropped to one knee and began pulling vegetation aside. More metal emerged. Then concrete. Then a narrow opening. His flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. A tunnel, hidden, sealed by nature for years, maybe decades. Rainwater streamed around its entrance. Roots hung across the opening like curtains. The tunnel was barely visible even from 10 feet away. No wonder nobody had found it. Or perhaps nobody had wanted it found. Ranger stepped forward, stopped, and stared into the darkness. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't advance. He simply stood there waiting. Caleb followed his gaze. Cold air drifted from the tunnel, not the fresh cold of the storm. The stale cold of underground spaces untouched by sunlight. Something existed beyond that opening. Something connected to the ship. Something connected to Mercy. Something connected to Thomas Ellison. The missing pieces of the story suddenly felt much closer. But not close enough. Not tonight. The storm was becoming dangerous. The tunnel wasn't going anywhere. Caleb memorized the location, then placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder. The dog remained staring into the darkness for several more seconds. Only then did he finally turn away. Together they started back toward the cabin through the rain. Behind them, hidden beneath decades of roots and silence, the tunnel waited, patient, forgotten, and no longer completely alone. The storm had passed by morning. A pale autumn sun rose through drifting fog, turning the Northwoods into a landscape of silver light and long shadows. Rainwater still clung to every pine needle. Small streams flowed through the forest floor, where the previous night's downpour had carved temporary channels through moss and stone. Caleb Rourke stood outside the cabin, staring toward the ridge. The hidden tunnel remained on his mind, not because he feared it, because he understood what it represented. Every mystery eventually reached a point where speculation ended and truth began. The tunnel was that point. Ranger sat beside him. The 7-year-old German Shepherd appeared calm again, though Caleb noticed subtle signs. The dog's ears tracked distant sounds. His posture remained alert. Whatever urgency had driven him through the storm had not completely faded. Caleb took a slow breath. Today they would find answers, or at least the next layer of questions. By mid-morning, Mara Ellison arrived in her Ranger truck. She stepped out carrying maps, flashlights, and a weatherproof field bag. The 51-year-old Ranger looked more tired than usual. She had likely spent most of the night thinking about her father. Thomas Ellison, a man who vanished 12 years ago while chasing the same mystery. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." Mara glanced toward Ranger. The dog stood immediately. "Looks like somebody already made up his mind. That's usually how it works." A second vehicle appeared a few minutes later. Sheriff Owen Briggs climbed out slowly. Age had stolen some speed from him, but none of his presence. At 65, Owen still carried himself like a man accustomed to responsibility. His broad frame filled his old leather jacket. His silver mustache and weathered face made him look like part of the Northwoods itself. Unlike Mara, Owen didn't look eager. He looked resigned, as if he had spent years hoping this day would never come. The three humans exchanged a few words before beginning the hike. No one spoke much during the climb. The forest did enough talking on its own. Wind moved through the treetops. Water dripped from branches. Far away, ravens called to one another. By the time they reached the tunnel entrance, the fog had mostly lifted. The opening looked even stranger in daylight. What appeared to be a natural limestone wall concealed a reinforced concrete structure hidden beneath decades of roots, vines, and moss. Caleb examined the entrance carefully. Military construction, not civilian. Built to last, built to disappear. Owen stared at it for several seconds. Then he sighed heavily. "I haven't seen this place in 30 years. Mara turned toward him. "You knew exactly where it was." "Not exactly." Owen rubbed his jaw. "I knew it existed." The silence that followed carried years of unspoken frustration. Finally, Mara asked the question she had been holding back. "What aren't you telling us?" Owen looked older suddenly. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man forced to revisit something he had buried long ago. "2 men died here." The words landed heavily. Caleb exchanged a glance with Mara. Owen continued. 30 years ago, before I became sheriff." His eyes never left the tunnel entrance. "They heard rumors, same as everyone else." "What happened?" Caleb asked. "They tried exploring without proper equipment." Owen swallowed. "The ceiling collapsed in one section." Mara's expression hardened. "And that's why you started the ghost stories." Owen nodded. "People are curious. Curiosity gets them killed. You could have told the truth." "No." His answer came immediately. "If I told the truth, dozens of people would have tried finding this place." Nobody argued. Because deep down they all knew he was right. The tunnel was exactly the kind of mystery that attracted trouble. Caleb activated his flashlight. "Let's go." The passage descended gradually. Cool air flowed through the darkness. The smell surprised Caleb. Not decay, not mold, dust, metal, old paper. The smell of forgotten history. The tunnel widened after roughly 50 yards. Concrete walls emerged from darkness. Electrical conduits ran along ceilings. Most lights had long since failed. Yet traces of human design remained everywhere. Military design. Careful, efficient, hidden. Ranger walked slightly ahead but remained close enough for Caleb to monitor him. The German Shepherd did not behave like a dog searching for clues. Instead, he moved like a trained professional navigating unfamiliar territory. Calm, methodical, focused. Eventually, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. Nobody spoke. For several moments, they simply stared. Rows of steel shelves stretched through the room. Storage cabinets lined the walls. Dust-covered crates sat stacked in organized sections. The place resembled an underground archive frozen in time. Mara slowly approached the nearest shelf. Her flashlight beam illuminated faded labels, documents, training manuals, personnel records, equipment logs, thousands of pages, years of forgotten history. Caleb opened one cabinet. Inside hung photographs. Dozens of them. Men and women in military uniforms, handlers, veterinarians, trainers, and dogs. So many dogs, German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, Labrador, working animals photographed beside their handlers. Some images showed training exercises. Others showed rescue operations. A few showed graduation ceremonies. The room felt strangely human, not because of the people, because of the dogs. Every photograph reflected loyalty, trust, partnership. The kind that could never be manufactured. Mara picked up a framed picture covered in dust. A young handler knelt beside a German Shepherd wearing rescue gear. The dog looked proud. The handler looked exhausted. Both looked happy. "It's amazing," she whispered, "and sad." Caleb understood. Entire lives had been forgotten down here, entire stories. Hours passed. They worked methodically, opening cabinets, cataloging records, taking photographs, building timelines. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. The Northwoods Project had focused on military rescue dogs. Not combat dogs, not attack dogs, rescue specialists. Animals trained to locate survivors after disasters, collapses, and remote emergencies. The program appeared innovative for its time, successful, respected. Then something changed. Around the late 1970s, records became inconsistent. Pages disappeared, names vanished. Reports stopped making sense. Someone had rewritten history. While sorting through personnel files, Mara suddenly froze, not because of a document, because of a photograph. A single photograph hidden between unrelated records. She stared at it silently. Her hands began trembling. Caleb moved closer. The image showed a group of trainers standing beside several rescue dogs. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then Mara pointed toward one man near the edge of the picture, a tall figure with dark hair and a familiar smile. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "That's him." Caleb looked closer. "Your father?" Mara nodded. But this photo was taken years after he supposedly stopped investigating. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Because the photograph suggested something impossible. Thomas Ellison had not simply researched the mystery. At some point, he had become part of it. The discovery changed the atmosphere. The tunnel no longer felt like a historical archive. Now it felt personal, directly connected to Thomas, directly connected to his disappearance. The deeper they searched, the stranger things became. Several personnel records carried a stamp. Decommissioned. The word appeared repeatedly, dozens of times. At first, Caleb assumed it referred to equipment, retired facilities, outdated systems. Then he realized the stamp appeared beside names, dogs' names. The realization made his stomach tighten. Mara read one file aloud. German Shepherd. Search and rescue certified. Excellent performance record. She turned the page. Decommissioned. Another file. Same result. Another, and another, and another. The term felt cold, clinical, dehumanizing. A bureaucratic word used to erase lives. Owen looked disturbed. What happened to them? Nobody had an answer. Not yet. The deeper truth remained hidden, somewhere farther inside, somewhere beyond the records. Late in the afternoon, they reached the end of the archive chamber. A second corridor extended beyond it. Narrower, older, more damaged. The ceiling showed signs of structural stress. Concrete fragments littered the floor. This section had clearly suffered damage years ago. The group moved carefully. Flashlights swept across cracked walls. The passage curved sharply, then ended. A massive steel door stood before them, or rather what remained of it. The upper section remained visible. The lower half had been crushed beneath fallen concrete and twisted support beams. Whatever lay beyond had been sealed by collapse for decades. Caleb stepped closer. The steel surface was scarred with rust. Faded warning labels remained partially visible. Restricted access. Authorized personnel only. Ranger stopped moving. The German Shepherd stood several feet away from the obstruction. His ears slowly lowered. His tail became still. The atmosphere shifted. Not fear, not aggression, something heavier, something deeper. The dogs stared at the collapsed doorway. Nobody spoke. Even Owen seemed reluctant to breathe. Then it happened. For the first time since arriving in Northwoods, Ranger lifted his head and howled. The sound echoed through the tunnel, long, mournful, heartbreaking. It rolled through the underground chambers and disappeared into darkness. The howl carried no threat, No warning. Only sorrow. The kind of sorrow that seemed too large for words, too old for memory, the kind that belonged to something lost, the kind that belonged to something waiting. And as the final echoes faded into silence, all three humans stood motionless before the ruined steel door. Because suddenly they understood one thing. Whatever truth had been buried beneath the Northwoods, it was waiting on the other side. The howl lingered long after it ended. For several seconds, nobody moved. The underground corridor seemed to absorb the last echoes of Ranger's voice, carrying them deeper into the darkness beyond the collapsed steel door. Caleb stood beside the German Shepherd. His hand rested lightly on the dog's shoulder. Ranger's posture had changed. Not frightened, not aggressive, just intensely focused. The 7-year-old K9 stared at the ruined doorway as though every instinct inside him pointed toward something hidden beyond it. Mara broke the silence first. "We need to know what's on the other side." Owen nodded slowly. His weathered face looked older than ever beneath the flashlight beam. "Then we'd better do it carefully." The following 2 days became a blur of work. Caleb contacted a structural engineer from Duluth. Mara secured temporary permission through the forestry department. Owen used old county records to locate original construction diagrams. The process was frustratingly slow, but Caleb had learned long ago that rushing into unstable structures got people killed, especially underground. By the 3rd day, they were ready. The damaged section of concrete was reinforced. The largest debris had been removed. A narrow opening now existed beside the collapsed door, just large enough for a person to enter. The first to go through was Caleb. His flashlight cut through decades of darkness. Dust drifted through the beam like tiny ghosts. The chamber beyond was surprisingly large. Rows of filing cabinets stood against the walls. Several storage lockers remained sealed. A long conference table occupied the center of the room. This had once been an operations center, the heart of whatever project had existed beneath the forest. One by one, the others entered. Ranger remained close to Caleb's side. The dog moved carefully, sniffing the air but not rushing ahead. Unlike before, he seemed content to let the humans lead. Hours passed as they searched. Most documents had suffered water damage. Others had been deliberately destroyed. Entire drawers stood empty. Yet enough remained, enough to tell a story, and it was not a good one. Caleb sat at the conference table reviewing a stack of reports. The more he read, the worse he felt. The Northwoods Canine Response Initiative had begun with good intentions. The military wanted specialized rescue dogs capable of locating survivors after natural disasters, mine collapses, and remote emergencies. Handlers trained side by side with the animals. The results had been extraordinary. Dogs located trapped victims faster than technology available at the time. Success reports filled the early years. Then came the accident, a major collapse. A tunnel section failed during a training exercise. Several handlers escaped. Several dogs did not. Caleb's jaw tightened as he continued reading. The trapped animals survived the initial collapse. There had been communication, tracking signals, audio evidence, even plans for a rescue operation. Then everything changed. Budget reviews, administrative meetings, cost assessments, political concerns. The reports became colder, more detached, less human. The language shifted from lives to expenses, from rescue to liability. Finally, one sentence appeared. Caleb read it twice, then a third time. Project termination recommended. Recovery operation not cost-effective. The words felt like a punch to the chest. Not cost-effective. Several living rescue dogs had been abandoned because rescuing them was considered too expensive. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Mara slowly lowered the document in her hands. Owen stared at the floor. Even the air felt heavier. "Dear God," Mara whispered. Caleb said nothing because he remembered Afghanistan, the mountains, the radio calls, the impossible choices, the moment when people had been reduced to numbers on a report. He hated that feeling, always had. Across the room, Ranger quietly rested beside the table, unaware of the documents, unaware of the politics, yet somehow carrying the weight of the story better than any human present. The dog simply existed, loyal, faithful, everything those reports were not. As afternoon faded toward evening, they uncovered another section of records. Personnel files, administrative correspondence, internal reviews. That was when Victor Hale's name appeared. Not Victor himself, his father, Richard Hale, a senior project administrator, one of the men responsible for final decisions. Mara stared at the file. "This is it." Caleb nodded. Richard Hale had not caused the collapse. The reports made that clear. But he had participated in the meetings afterward. He had signed approval forms. He had endorsed termination recommendations. His signature appeared repeatedly, again and again and again. The deeper they searched, the clearer the picture became. The Hale family had spent decades protecting more than a reputation. They had been protecting a legacy built partly upon silence. Near sunset, Mara opened a sealed envelope hidden inside one of the cabinets. Unlike most documents, this one had survived almost perfectly. The paper inside contained only a single handwritten sentence. No signature, no date, no explanation. Just one line. If anyone ever finds this place, tell them the dogs never stopped waiting. The room fell silent. Even Owen seemed unable to look away. For a moment, the underground chamber no longer felt like an abandoned facility. It felt like a message left behind for someone who had finally arrived decades too late. Night settled outside. The group continued searching under lantern light. Then Ranger stood. Caleb noticed immediately. The dog wasn't alerting. He wasn't warning. He simply walked away from the main room. Slowly, purposefully, Caleb followed. The passage beyond the operations center was narrow and partially flooded. The walls grew rougher, less finished, more like natural stone. Ranger stopped before a section of wall. There was no dramatic reaction. No barking, no scratching, only stillness. Caleb examined the area. A rusted maintenance door stood partly concealed behind fallen shelving. The hinges had almost fused shut. Found something? Mara called. Maybe. It took nearly 20 minutes to force the door open. The metal groaned loudly. Dust spilled outward. Cold air drifted from the darkness beyond. Inside waited a small room, far smaller than the others, almost private, like an office or a refuge. A single cot stood against one wall. A lantern sat atop a wooden crate. Several notebooks rested nearby. The room felt strangely personal, as if someone had occupied it long after everyone else had left. Mara entered slowly, then stopped. Caleb immediately saw the change in her expression. Her face had gone pale. She wasn't looking at the notebooks. She wasn't looking at the cot. She was staring at something on the floor, a human skeleton, partially collapsed with age. The remains rested beside the cot as though the individual had sat down one final time and never risen again. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Mara stepped forward, carefully, trembling, her eyes filled with tears. The skeleton wore remnants of old outdoor clothing, a faded jacket, decayed boots, fragments of equipment, nothing conclusive, until Mara saw the watch. The watch remained attached to one skeletal wrist, worn, scratched, weathered by time, but unmistakable. She dropped to her knees. No, her voice cracked. The sound echoed softly through the room. No. Caleb knelt beside her. Mara reached forward with shaking fingers, touching the watch, touching the evidence she had searched for during 12 years of unanswered questions. My father. Nobody corrected her. Nobody needed to. The certainty in her voice was absolute. Thomas Ellison had been here. Thomas Ellison had survived long enough to reach this room, and Thomas Ellison had died alone beneath the forest. Tears rolled silently down Mara's face. Not dramatic, not uncontrolled. Just the quiet grief of a daughter finally finding the truth she had feared for years. Owen removed his hat. His eyes glistened. The old sheriff looked as though he carried guilt heavier than his age. Even Ranger approached carefully. The German shepherd sat beside Mara without touching her, without demanding attention, simply present, a steady companion in a moment of pain. Mara stared at the watch, then at the notebooks beside the cot. Her father's notebooks, the final pieces of his story, the answers she had spent more than a decade chasing. Outside, night covered the Northwoods. Deep beneath the forest, among forgotten records and buried truths, a daughter finally found the man she had never stopped looking for. And for the first time since arriving in Northwoods, Caleb realized this mystery was no longer only about abandoned dogs, hidden tunnels, or old military secrets. It was about people. The living, the dead, and the promises they leave behind. The notebooks remained untouched for nearly an hour. Not because nobody wanted to read them, because nobody was ready. The small underground room had become something sacred. A place suspended between grief and truth. Mara Ellison sat quietly beside the remains of her father. The flashlight resting near her feet cast a soft glow across the old cot and scattered papers. For 12 years she had imagined countless possibilities. She had pictured accidents, violence, even abandonment. She had prepared herself for almost everything except certainty. Now certainty sat only a few feet away. Thomas Ellison was no longer missing. He had been found. The realization brought relief and heartbreak in equal measure. Across the room, Caleb Rourke leaned against the wall. The former Navy SEAL had spent most of his adult life learning how to control emotion. Military training taught discipline. Combat taught endurance. Neither taught what to do when someone else's grief awakened your own. Ranger rested beside him. The 7-year-old German shepherd sat calmly, his dark, intelligent eyes moving between Caleb and Mara. The dog seemed unusually quiet, as though even he understood the weight of the moment. Finally, Mara picked up the first notebook. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she began reading. The earliest entries described investigation, questions, suspicions. Thomas had spent years studying the old Northwoods project. At first, he believed the rumors were exaggerated. government mistakes, lost records, small acts of negligence, nothing more. But the deeper he looked, the more disturbing the truth became. The entries became darker, more urgent. Thomas wrote about disappearing files, missing reports, conversations abruptly ending when certain names were mentioned. Several times he mentioned Richard Hale, Victor Hale's father, not as a villain, not as a monster, as a man protecting something. A man terrified that old decisions would destroy everything his family had built. Caleb noticed that detail immediately. Reality was rarely simple. The people responsible had not viewed themselves as evil. They had convinced themselves they were being practical. History was full of tragedies born from practical decisions. Hours passed. The group continued reading. One notebook described the collapse itself. A tunnel section had failed during a large-scale rescue exercise. Multiple handlers escaped. Several dogs remained trapped underground. Initial assessments indicated rescue was possible. The trapped animals were alive. Food deliveries had even been discussed. Emergency excavation plans existed. Then came administrative intervention. Budget reviews, legal concerns, political pressure. The rescue operation was canceled. The surviving dogs were abandoned. The room fell silent. Nobody needed to speak. The cruelty of the decision spoke for itself. Mara slowly turned another page. A folded photograph slipped free. She picked it up carefully. The image showed several rescue dogs standing beside handlers during training. One German Shepherd stood at the center. Its ears were tall, its expression alert, its eyes intelligent. On the back, someone had written a name, Mercy. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The photograph somehow felt more painful than the reports. Statistics were easy to ignore. A face was not. She was real, Mara whispered. Caleb nodded. Yes, the word carried more weight than he intended, because somewhere in his mind another face appeared. Another dog, another memory. One he spent years trying not to revisit. Near the back of the final notebook, Mara discovered a sealed envelope. Unlike the other documents, it was addressed. Not to any government agency. Not to investigators. Not to the public, simply to whoever finally finds this room. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas Ellison's. Mara carefully unfolded the letter. The first sentence stopped everyone cold. If you are reading this, then I kept my promise longer than I ever expected. For a moment, the underground room seemed smaller, closer, as though Thomas himself had reached across 12 years to speak directly to them. Mara continued reading aloud. The letter revealed everything. Thomas had not become trapped. He had stayed voluntarily. After uncovering the truth, he realized many critical documents were being destroyed. Evidence was disappearing. Witnesses were aging. People wanted the story forgotten. So he made a choice. He gathered records, photographs, reports, personal testimonies. Then he hid them, not for himself, for the future, for whoever might one day be willing to listen. The deeper they read, the more extraordinary the story became. Thomas eventually discovered a sealed maintenance section beyond the damaged tunnels. There he found something nobody expected, the remains of Mercy, the final missing rescue dog. According to Thomas's notes, Mercy had survived longer than anyone imagined. Evidence suggested the dog had remained alive for weeks after the collapse. Long enough to leave tracks, long enough to move between sections, long enough to wait. The final entries became increasingly emotional. Thomas stopped writing like an investigator. He began writing like a witness, like a man carrying somebody else's pain. One entry described sitting beside Mercy's remains for hours. Another described speaking aloud to the dog, apologizing, not because he was responsible, because someone needed to. Mara wiped tears from her eyes. Even Owen turned away briefly. The old sheriff stared into darkness beyond the room. His shoulders seemed heavier than before, perhaps because he had spent decades protecting a secret without understanding its full cost. Then Mara reached the final journal entry, the last page, the final words her father ever wrote. Her voice shook as she read. Those dogs did not abandon us. She paused. The room became perfectly still. Then she continued. We abandoned them. The sentence struck Caleb like a physical blow. His breathing stopped. His chest tightened. Suddenly he wasn't underground anymore. He was back in Afghanistan. Back among mountains and smoke. Back inside the memory he had spent years burying. The mission had gone wrong. Communication failed. Extraction failed. Everything failed. One teammate had been trapped. So had a military working dog. Rescue attempts became impossible. Orders were given. Withdrawal became mandatory. Caleb remembered hearing the arguments, remembered hearing the anger, the desperation, the helplessness. Most of all, he remembered leaving, surviving, living, while others did not. For years he told himself there had been no choice. For years he repeated every logical explanation available. None of them worked. Because logic rarely healed guilt. The final words from Thomas's journal shattered something inside him. Not because they accused him, because they understood him. Caleb lowered his head. For the first time in years, tears came. Not dramatic tears, not loud ones. Just quiet grief finally finding a way out. Nobody interrupted. Nobody offered advice. Some wounds did not need fixing. They needed witnessing. Mara simply sat nearby. Owen remained silent, and Ranger moved closer. The German shepherd gently lowered himself beside Caleb. His warm shoulder touched Caleb's leg. Nothing more. No tricks. No commands. No heroic gesture. Just presence. Steady, faithful. Enough. Hours later, they returned to the cabin. The night outside was calm. Stars filled the northern sky. The forest seemed different now, not because the mystery had ended, because part of it finally made sense. Mara carried her father's journals. Owen carried copies of the evidence. Caleb carried something less visible, a burden that felt slightly lighter. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled softly. Nobody spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary. Around midnight, Mara finally left for town. Owen departed shortly afterward. Soon only Caleb and Ranger remained. The cabin settled into silence. Caleb sat near the fire. The old photograph of Mercy rested on the table. Outside, wind moved gently through the pines. Inside, Ranger lay beside the hearth. Neither slept. Not immediately. At some point during the night, Caleb looked toward the dog. Ranger was already watching him. The German shepherd's dark eyes reflected the firelight. Steady, patient, trusting. Caleb thought about Mercy. About Thomas, about promises, about loyalty. About all the ways humans failed and dogs continued loving them anyway. His throat tightened again. Not from grief this time. From gratitude. The fire burned lower. The cabin grew quieter, and somewhere beyond the darkness of the Northwoods, the truth that had waited decades was finally beginning to breathe again. While Ranger remained beside him through the long northern night, Caleb understood something he had not understood for many years. Sometimes healing does not arrive through answers. Sometimes it arrives through companionship, through loyalty, through a dog who stays when everyone else leaves, and through a promise that refuses to die. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow fell across the Northwoods in late October, covering the pine forest in a quiet blanket of white. The old ship stood against the hillside exactly as it always had, but somehow it looked different now, not because the steel had changed, because the truth had. For decades, the rusted hull had hidden a story nobody wanted to tell. Now that story belonged to the world. The weeks following the discovery moved faster than anyone expected. Federal investigators arrived first, then historians, then journalists, then representatives from military archives. The forgotten project buried beneath the forest suddenly became national news. At first, Caleb hated the attention. The 43-year-old former Navy SEAL had never enjoyed crowds, cameras, or public conversations. His broad shoulders and disciplined posture attracted attention even when he wanted none, and the sharp angles of his weathered face made him look intimidating to strangers. But attention was no longer about him. It was about the dogs. It was about Mercy. It was about the handlers who had spent decades carrying guilt. And it was about Thomas Ellison. Mara spent long hours working alongside investigators. The strong, determined Ranger who had spent 12 years searching for her father finally had answers. The grief remained, but uncertainty was gone. For the first time in more than a decade, she no longer woke up wondering where he was. She knew, and knowing hurt less than not knowing. One afternoon, while federal archivists reviewed evidence recovered from the underground facility, Victor Hale finally came to the cabin. He arrived alone. No lawyers, no assistants, no expensive SUV, just an aging man carrying a cardboard box. Victor looked older than he had only weeks earlier. The tall timber company owner still wore his charcoal coat and polished boots, but the confidence Caleb had first noticed seemed diminished. Years of silence had become heavier than pride. Ranger watched him approach from the porch. The German shepherd remained calm, neither friendly nor hostile, simply observant, as always. Victor stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Victor held out the box. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "The rest." Caleb opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, correspondence, meeting records, everything the Hale family had quietly kept hidden for decades. Victor exhaled slowly. "My father believed he was protecting the town." Caleb remained silent. Victor stared toward the distant ridge. "He wasn't a cruel man, I know." He convinced himself there was nothing left to save. The words hung in the cold air. Sometimes tragedy wasn't created by monsters. Sometimes it was created by ordinary people choosing comfort over courage. Victor nodded once. "I spent years defending him." His voice cracked slightly. "Then I read Thomas's journals." For the first time, Caleb saw genuine regret in the man's eyes. Not fear, not self-preservation. Regret, the kind that comes too late. Victor handed Caleb the final folder. People deserve the truth. Then he left. And for the first time since arriving in Northwoods, Caleb believed Victor Hale had finally forgiven neither his father nor himself. Several weeks later, during the federal review process, investigators uncovered one final item among the recovered records. Not a classified report, not a government file. A faded training photograph. The image showed a line of rescue dogs standing beside their handlers. Nothing remarkable at first glance, until someone noticed a handwritten note across the bottom. A trainer had written, "The dogs always go where they're needed, even when people don't." The photograph was later displayed beside Mercy's story, and somehow that simple sentence spread farther than any official report. People remembered it, shared it, quoted it, because deep down, everyone recognized the truth inside it. By early spring, plans for a memorial were underway. The decision surprised many outsiders. Some expected the ship to be dismantled. Others wanted it removed entirely. Instead, the community chose something different, something better. The weeping ship would remain. Engineers stabilized the structure. Trails were built. Historical markers were installed. The underground facility was documented and sealed for preservation. The old patrol vessel became a permanent memorial dedicated to military working dogs and rescue K-9 teams. The dedication ceremony took place beneath a bright blue sky. Hundreds attended: veterans, handlers, families, local residents. Former military personnel traveled from across the country. Many brought photographs of dogs they had served beside. Some brought collars, some brought medals, some brought stories. During the ceremony, Mara stood before the crowd. The wind moved gently through her chestnut-brown hair. Her green-gray eyes reflected both sadness and peace. She spoke briefly about her father, not as a hero, not as a martyr, simply as a man who believed truth mattered. When she finished, nobody applauded immediately. They stood in silence, a deeper form of respect. Nearby, a separate stone marker had been placed beneath a young pine tree. The inscription was simple: "Mercy faithful until the end." Visitors left flowers there. Children left tennis balls. Veterans sometimes left challenge coins. Over time, the memorial became one of the most visited locations in the region. Not because of mystery, because of meaning. Months passed. The news cycle moved on. Investigators completed their reports. The world found new stories to discuss. But Northwoods remained, the forest remained, and Caleb remained. One morning in late summer, sunlight spilled across the clearing behind the cabin. The building looked different now. The roof had been repaired. The porch had been rebuilt. The windows reflected blue sky instead of neglect. The place no longer felt abandoned. It felt lived in, home. Caleb stepped outside carrying a mug of coffee. The air smelled of pine and warm earth. Birdsong drifted through the trees. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing, living. The kind of ordinary moment he once believed impossible. Years earlier, after leaving the military, he had wandered from place to place carrying ghosts he refused to face. Now the ghosts remained, but they no longer controlled him. Healing had not erased pain. It had taught him how to carry it. A familiar sound drew his attention. Ranger, the German shepherd, was already halfway up the trail leading toward the ship. At 7 years old, the dog moved with slightly less speed than before, but not less purpose. Caleb smiled. "Same routine, huh?" Ranger glanced back once, then continued. Some habits never changed. Together they followed the path through the trees. The memorial stood quiet beneath the morning sun. Visitors would arrive later. For now, it belonged to the forest, and to them. Ranger walked to his favorite spot near the base of the old hull, then sat. The dog no longer searched, no longer investigated, no longer listened for hidden tunnels or forgotten secrets. Those days were over. Instead, he simply watched. Water flowed through the rusted steel and down the rocks in shining streams. Years earlier, people said the ship sounded like it was crying. Perhaps it had. Perhaps places carried sorrow just as people did. But Caleb no longer heard grief when he listened. He heard peace. He sat beside Ranger, neither spoke, neither needed to. The Northwoods stretched around them, ancient, patient, forgiving. The sunlight reflected from the weathered steel, and for a moment the old ship seemed less like a wound and more like a monument. Not to tragedy, to loyalty, to courage, to promises kept. Ranger remained perfectly still. His intelligent dark eyes followed the flowing water, the same water that had once seemed like tears. Now it looked different. Caleb realized why. Because tears belonged to loss, and this place no longer belonged to loss. The truth had been told. The forgotten had been remembered. The dead had been named. The living had been healed. The ship had not become beautiful because the past changed. It had become beautiful because the past was finally acknowledged. A gentle breeze moved through the pines. Ranger leaned lightly against Caleb's leg. The gesture lasted only a second, just enough. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. Far above them, sunlight glimmered across the old steel hull. The water continued its endless journey down the rocks. Not like sorrow, not like regret, like release. And as the forest breathed quietly around them, Caleb understood that some places are not meant to hide the dead forever. Some places exist so that, eventually, souls can find their way home. As this story comes to an end, perhaps the greatest lesson is not about a forgotten ship, a hidden tunnel, or even a decades-old secret. It is about loyalty. Mercy and the other rescue dogs never abandoned their mission. They never stopped being faithful. Even when people failed them, they remained what God created them to be: steadfast, devoted, and willing to give everything for others. Sometimes we imagine miracles as dramatic events. We look for signs in the sky or answers that arrive all at once. But many of God's miracles arrive quietly. They arrive through a loyal friend who stays beside us in our darkest hour, through the courage to tell the truth after years of silence, through the strength to forgive, through the chance to finally bring light into places that have lived in darkness for far too long. In our daily lives, we all carry something hidden: a regret, a wound, a memory, a promise we never fulfilled. This story reminds us that healing begins when we stop running from the truth and have the courage to face it. What is buried may remain hidden for a season, but in God's timing, truth has a way of finding its way back into the light. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Your words may encourage someone else who is carrying a burden of their own. If you enjoyed this journey with Caleb and Ranger, please like this video, share it with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories of courage, faith, loyalty, and second chances. And wherever you are today, may God watch over you and your loved ones. May He bring peace to your heart, strength to your struggles, wisdom to your decisions, and hope to your future. May His blessings follow you through every season of life, and may you never walk alone. Thank you for being part of this story. Until next time, may God bless and protect you always.